This week, it's the last episode of 2020, which means it's time for an end-of-the-year overview of the big trends in the Jewish world. Sure, the year has been defined by the COVID-19 pandemic, but as we look out on the horizon toward 2021, with vaccines rolling out, there's a lot more to the story of what makes the Jews tired. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. First, a hearty thanks to our corporate sponsor, Darla Kashian with RBC Wealth Management, for supporting this podcast. Okay, so a huge disclaimer. For the sake of not talking for 12 hours straight, a lot here is overly simplified. This is an overview, not an exhaustive deep dive, of 5 main trends in the Jewish world and Jewish news, some of which has been covered by this podcast, and some of which probably will be. Starting with the long ago, but also not that long ago, past. Number 1, after several years of escalating attacks on Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews in the New York City area, a shooting at a kosher grocery store in New Jersey, and a machete attack during a Hanukkah celebration in New York City got American Jewry up in arms about the issue. What followed was a wave of marches and rallies in several cities, including Minneapolis, with the message, "No hate, no fear." The rallies were largely put on by non-Orthodox Jews trying to express solidarity with the community being targeted, and for a moment it felt like out of these rallies there was a chance to build from expression to a real understanding and relationship between parts of the Jewish world that otherwise don't really get along. You can go back and listen to episode 15 of this podcast to revisit this. Number 2, President Trump's big Israeli-Palestinian deal of the century peace deal was about to be unveiled. And then it was at the end of January. There was a lot of noise, a pretty release ceremony, but not a lot of faith, as both Palestinian leadership and the Israeli political right wing quickly rejected the plan. Episode 18 of this podcast is your listen about that. Number 3, Israel's third elections in the span of a year were underway after negotiations failed yet again to create a coalition in the Knesset, Israel's parliament, that would be able to run a stable government. It was an exciting and exhausting time where one couldn't help but joke about a fourth election. Episode 10 of this podcast is your guide to that. Number 4, the U.S. election cycle was getting particularly heated as the Democrats had yet to narrow down to one presidential candidate. And the usual hubbub over the Jewish vote and its impact drew a lot of attention, even though it wasn't necessarily going to have any massive effect on either the primaries or the election. Partly all that attention was because a lot of Jews were in the running, most prominently Senator Bernie Sanders and former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Check episode 20 to revisit that. And finally, number 5, a slow-burning but maybe less flashy and newsy trend. Jewish institutions like synagogues were dealing with the long-standing pressures of figuring out how to be more accessible and reach more Jews. So here's then how those trends are looking like now in the present and where that leaves us on the potential future. Number 1, when it comes to the attacks on Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews, there have been fewer attacks because of lockdowns and pandemic restrictions, but lots and lots of online toxicity toward those communities. A lot of that has to do with being very publicly called out by the governor of New York and the mayor of New York City for hosting large events like funerals and weddings during the pandemic. It should be noted that all kinds of mass gatherings have been done in non-Jewish communities, and secular events have also been held during the pandemic, but it's often Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews who are seen to be connected or particularly spreading the pandemic, with a suspiciously large number of news articles about the pandemic being published with photos of the Orthodox community, even when the articles have nothing to do with Jews. That's likely to mean a lot more anti-Semitism that will be expressed over the next year, unfortunately. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency has a great piece linked in the podcast notes on what happened to the big talk about Jewish unity and solidarity during those no hate, no fear rallies a year ago. And basically, it's all fallen apart. The Orthodox community is very politically conservative, has protested and sued against pandemic restrictions in the name of religious liberty, and sees the police as essential to their safety. The non-Orthodox community is largely liberal, supportive of pandemic restrictions, and is seen by the Orthodox community to have been swept up in the defund the police movement after the death of George Floyd on Memorial Day in Minneapolis. The pandemic drove all of us into our political corners and made us less likely to reach across the aisle. So I'll be expecting a lot more talk in 2021 about Jewish unity in the face of anti-Semitism and the difficulty in building bridges in a distinctly divided American Jewish community. Number 2, at this point, President Trump's Israeli-Palestinian peace plan is pretty much dust in the wind, but it and the talks of partial Israeli annexation of the West Bank that the plan inspired have helped lead to a breakthrough in regional relations. Countries in the Middle East and North Africa that have had a secret relationship with Israel, but were never, ever going to publicly normalize relations with the Jewish state, are now almost tripping over themselves to do so. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. The big draw, of course, is American financial aid in exchange for official peace with Israel. And there's a lot of guessing about, what Arab country or what countries will be next to normalize relations with Israel. And the big kahuna, if you will, is Saudi Arabia. So we'll see what ends up with that. But it's fascinating to see that years of Western and American Middle East policy convinced that Israel would never be accepted by its neighbors unless the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was resolved, that policy isn't looking so well informed now. Episode 42 of this podcast covered this more in depth, so feel free to check that out for more detail. Number 3, well, I know I joked about the 4th Israeli elections in 2 years, but now we're in the 4th Israeli elections in under 2 years, and it's kind of annoying. I covered how this came to be in the previous podcast episode, number 48, but the short story is that Israel's political parties and their leaders just don't want to get along. In particular, a whole lot of the Israeli political scene is focused on trying to get Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu out of office. Personally, I'm already looking forward to the 5th election in under 3 years, because, why not keep the streak going? The elections happen in March, and the actual act of creating a stable government could take until June, so get ready for another bumpy ride. Number 4, the U.S. presidential elections and the Jewish vote. By any indications, the Jewish vote was pretty much as predicted. Most of the Jews voted for President-elect Biden, though the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities overwhelmingly voted for President Trump. Did the Jewish vote make a big difference? Maybe in some individual areas, but in the country as a whole, that just doesn't seem to be the case. But Jews are still center stage because in Georgia, the last 2 Senate seats of this election cycle are going to be decided in a runoff election on January 6th. The Republican candidates are 2 white people, and the Democratic candidates, well, a black pastor who serves the church where Martin Luther King Jr. worked, and a white Jew. So lots of talk about the modern Black-Jewish alliance there. Check out The Jews Are Tired episode 46 for more details on that. On one hand, Georgia is known to lean more Republican in runoff elections, but on the other hand, for the first time in a long time, a Democratic presidential candidate, Joe Biden, won Georgia. So all eyes will be on those Senate seats to see what happens. And number 5, about Jewish institutions adapting to the 21st century with accessibility. The pandemic really kicked everyone into gear to not only stream services, but be streaming focused and all Jewish programming, which is the difference between a camera focused on the back of the cantor and a Zoom service where you can see everyone's face, which led, in the case of some synagogues, to see a large increase in the number of people tuning in. Although this is less true for, of course, Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities who can't use something like Zoom on Shabbat and Jewish holidays. On this podcast, back in April for episode 28, I spoke with Allison Darcy about that trend toward online accessibility and what might come of it even after the pandemic is over. Synagogues will soon have to figure out how to prioritize between in-person and streamed events, and there are also questions about how to stay financially afloat when Zoom programming has been largely available for free. I recommend going back to revisit that episode with Darcy for some bigger brain thoughts, but it's likely the transition of Jewish life after the pandemic will be a little rough, to say the least. And just for some final thoughts, obviously this has been an absolutely wild and unbelievable and upsetting and mind-blowing year, but I'm proud of the fact that this podcast kept going, and it kept going with some pretty cool stuff. Some of my favorite episodes of this year have involved stuff like, for episode 27, interviewing Olga Khazan, a Russian Jewish journalist for The Atlantic, all about her book Weird, all about being weird. It was fascinating to speak with Marisa Gage, the research manager at the Minneapolis Jewish Federation, for episode 40, and talk through the recent Jewish population study done in the Twin Cities area. As part of a TC Jewfolk series looking at the historical connection between the Jewish community and racial inequalities in Minneapolis, an episode of this podcast had Russell Starr-Lack, a college researcher, on to talk about some of the history of the local Black-Jewish relationship. That was episode 43. And even the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, was kind enough to come on this podcast and answer some candid questions about Holocaust education, Jewish safety, and other topics. That was for episode 44. And there have been other great episodes and interviews on all kinds of topics this year, or at least episodes and interviews that I enjoyed. So feel free to go back through the archives and give a listen if an episode you missed strikes your fancy. And really, overall, to anyone and everyone who listens or has listened to this podcast, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. I tend to have, blinders on. I'm just a dude writing, recording, editing, and producing this thing, a podcast. But it's nothing without people to listen in and hopefully gain some benefit to thinking about why the Jews are tired. So thank you again for listening. If you've got feedback, get in touch at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. And if you want to help support this podcast and the work Jewfolk Inc. does, a link to donate is in the podcast notes. We greatly appreciate it. I wish I had a great big heartwarming message about leaving 2020 behind and, better hopes for 2021, but I'm not sure I have it in me, just to be honest. What I will say is something I repeat every once in a while on this podcast. The Jews before us kept moving forward, and you know what? We can too. So take a moment to appreciate that you've made it through this year, and I'll see you on the other side in 2021. Happy New Year. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.